Imagine this. You find yourself in the middle of the endless Alaskan wilderness. The temperature outside is minus 40 degrees. All around you is nothing but snow, silence, and the endless darkness of the polar night.
You don't have warm clothes, no food supplies, and no survival gear. All you have is a parachute and a few small items in your pocket. Most people wouldn't last even a week in such conditions. But one man, Lieutenant Leon Crane, managed to survive for more than 80 days in this brutal environment. His story is a powerful testimony of human spirit, endurance, and what a person is capable of when everything around screams, "You are doomed." Today, you will hear the unbelievable story of how a plane crash turned a young pilot into a true survival hero. This is the case of Leon Crane, who in 1944 spent 3 long winter months fighting for life in the Yukon wilderness, one of the harshest and most unforgiving places on Earth. Let's start, as always, from the very beginning. On December 21, 1943, Lieutenant Leon Crane was on a training flight aboard a heavy B-24 Liberator bomber. He was the co-pilot, one of 5 men making up the crew. The aircraft lifted off from Ladd Field Air Base in Fairbanks, Alaska, heading east. But after covering about 125 miles, serious trouble began. First, one of the 4 engines failed, and soon after, the plane completely lost control. It became clear there was no chance of avoiding a crash. At that moment, the commander gave the order: abandon the aircraft immediately. Leon Crane and his comrade, Staff Sergeant Richard Pompeo, grabbed their parachutes and, without hesitation, jumped through the open bomb bay doors. Moments later, the bomber spun into a deadly dive. The other 3 crew members never made it out in time. They were killed when the plane smashed into the rocky slopes and thick forests of the Yukon, near the Charlie River. As Crane's parachute opened, he could see Sergeant Pompeo being carried by the wind, drifting far beyond the mountain ridge. The icy air bit into his skin like a knife. The temperature in Alaska that day had plunged to 40 degrees below zero. After landing, Crane found himself buried waist-deep in snow. He shouted several times, hoping for a response, but only silence answered him back. Around him stretched nothing but wild, unforgiving wilderness, with no signs of life anywhere. Climbing to the top of a nearby hill, he spotted a column of black smoke rising from the wreck of their plane. The crash site was only about a kilometer away. Crane tried to push his way through the drifts toward the wreck, but it quickly became obvious that it was hopeless. The snow was chest-deep in places, and without skis or snowshoes, there was no way to make progress. So, following his training, he decided to stay close by. His logic was simple: a bomber that size doesn't just disappear. Rescue teams would certainly be sent to look for them. He only needed to wait. Luckily, he was wearing a warm-down parka. The
U.S. Army had only recently begun issuing them to pilots, and in this moment, it was a lifesaver. Outside, the brutal Alaskan cold showed no mercy. When he searched his pockets, he discovered just 2 boxes of matches and a small parachute knife.
That was the full extent of his survival gear. To increase his chances of being spotted from the air, Crane moved toward a more open area near the twisting Charlie River. Struggling through the deep snow nearly drained him, but eventually he reached a clearing by the riverbank. There, the wind had swept the ice clear, leaving the frozen river gleaming like a bright white road. Walking on the ice was far easier, but Crane decided to stay put and wait for help. He gathered some dry pine branches, then pulled a letter from his father out of his breast pocket. He read it once more and then used it to start a fire. The resin-filled branches caught quickly, flaring up with bright yellow flames. Warming his frozen fingers, he wrapped himself in his parachute and settled in to wait. On Alaska's polar nights, darkness lasts for about 20 hours a day. During the brief stretch of daylight, Crane had to gather more firewood. Without a fire, he would have frozen to death almost instantly once temperatures plunged below minus 40 at night. His silk parachute doubled as both a sleeping bag and a makeshift shelter, but the cold still bit deep into his bones. The fire was his only real source of warmth. He kept listening, straining to hear the drone of an aircraft overhead, but rescue never came. Soon, hunger began to gnaw at him. Desperate, he tried to craft a bow and arrows to hunt squirrels. But the attempt failed. The squirrels were far too quick, and chasing them through waist-deep snow was simply impossible. 6 long days dragged by. At that point, Crane finally realized the truth. No rescue was coming. Waiting any longer meant certain death. Hunger was draining the last of his strength, so he made a choice. He would have to find people on his own. But the task ahead was almost impossible. The nearest settlement was over 150 miles away, across endless forests, frozen mountains, and the harsh Yukon tundra. The only real chance of survival was to follow the frozen river. Walking on ice was far easier than forcing his way through deep snow, since the wind swept the surface clean, leaving a hard white trail. And there was logic in this plan. People usually built their homes near rivers, so heading downstream would eventually lead to a village. The risk, however, was obvious. In a place like Alaska, settlements were few and far between, and the search could last much longer than his strength would allow. Still, Crane had no other option. Step by step, he moved downstream, wrapping himself in his parachute each night and keeping a fire alive to survive the deadly cold. On the second day of this desperate journey, something extraordinary happened. Among the scattered pines on the riverbank, he spotted the outline of a cabin roof. He hurried toward the cabin. It was a small wooden shelter, and to his surprise, the door wasn't even locked. For a brief moment, Crane thought he had finally found salvation. But when he pushed the door open, he realized the place was empty. Still, this discovery was nothing short of a miracle. Inside, he stumbled upon what felt like a treasure chest of survival: a wood stove, canned food, bags of sugar, and powdered milk. In the corner stood a rifle and a pair of snowshoes, while near the door hung a set of moose-hide mittens. There were frying pans, tin cups, and even a canvas tent. It all looked as if the owner had just stepped out for a short while. Frozen and starved, Crane soon warmed his hands around a steaming cup of hot cocoa. It seemed like things were finally turning in his favor. But the hunter he expected never came back that evening. On the cabin door, Crane noticed a name: Phil Barrel. He knew that hunters in Alaska usually maintained several cabins like this, stringing traps and snares between them. Before the season, they would stockpile supplies and then move from one cabin to another, often covering great distances. That meant Phil Barrel, a trapper and prospector, might have been in town or at another cabin. And if that was the case, he might not return here for months, maybe not even until the next season. So the very next morning, after warming up and regaining some strength, Crane decided to keep searching. He left the cabin and began looking for trails, snares, or any sign of the hunter. All day he wandered through the woods, but he found nothing. His worst fears were confirmed. The hunter wasn't anywhere nearby. If he had been, Crane surely would have stumbled upon a trap or at least some tracks. Disheartened, he went back to the cabin, which stood nearly 105 miles from the nearest settlement. And then a brutal snowstorm struck, lasting 6 full days. The wind howled down the chimney so fiercely it felt like the entire cabin might be torn apart. In those moments, Lieutenant Crane silently thanked God he had found the shelter. Without it, relying only on a fire and a parachute for warmth, he would have frozen to death without question. During those days, he managed to recover some strength. His routine was simple. He woke up, ate a little, and listened carefully to the wind, hoping to hear the bark of a dog sled team or the hum of an airplane. But the daylight hours were short, only a few at best. Afterward, he ate again and went back to sleep. By now, weeks had passed since the crash. And while the cabin was comfortable, Crane realized one harsh truth: he might be waiting here for rescue far longer than he could afford. His food supply was already starting to run low. To give himself a real chance at survival, he built a simple sled out of a few wooden planks. On it, he packed a canvas tent, a handful of canned food, grabbed a rifle, strapped on a pair of snowshoes, and stepped back onto the frozen river. Lieutenant Crane kept moving downstream along the icy surface of the Charlie River. His journey didn't last just a few days, it stretched on for more than 2 long months. The supplies he had taken from the cabin ran out quickly. He tried to hunt, but in all that time, he managed to catch only a few grouse. More than once, the ice gave way beneath him, plunging him into the freezing water. By sheer luck and willpower, he always managed to claw his way back out. It felt as if his wandering would never come to an end. But then, on March 9th, over 80 days after the crash, Crane finally stumbled upon a small clearing covered in scattered pine branches. There, pressed into the snow, he spotted the track of a dog sled. His heart raced with hope. Could this be the end of his suffering? He pushed forward, rushing through the forest, until he stepped into another clearing. This time, a cabin stood ahead of him. And unlike before, there were clear signs of life smoke curling from the chimney and freshly washed clothes hanging on a line outside. A man stepped out of the cabin. For a moment, he just stared at Crane, then calmly lit a cigarette. It turned out to be the home of a hunter named Albert Ames. After hearing Crane's unbelievable story, this man in torn clothes, wearing a strange bulky jacket with messy, unkempt hair, Ames was stunned. Crane had managed to cover nearly 180 kilometers down the frozen river, completely alone, with no real experience, right in the middle of Alaska's brutal winter. The hunter sat him down and fed him hot pancakes and a hearty moose steak. In his own report, Crane later wrote, "My beard was about 2 inches long, black as coal. My hair had grown out wild, covering my ears and hanging almost into my eyes. I looked more like some kind of prehistoric creature. My face was filthy, sunburned, and weather-beaten. And from 2 dark circles, my own eyes stared back at me. The next morning, Ames harnessed his dog sled team and carried Crane to the nearest airfield. At last, he was saved." One of his friends later recalled that moment. "I happened to be standing in the lobby when a major rushed in from operations with shocking news. A pilot from Veen Alaska Airlines had just radioed that he was bringing in Lieutenant Crane. We immediately asked if Crane was alive or dead. The reply came crackling back, very much alive. About 5 of us jumped straight into a car and sped off to Weeks Field in Fairbanks. At 7 o'clock in the evening, the plane finally landed. And out of it jumped good old Crane. The moment was overwhelming. We rushed to him, hugged him, shook his hands, hardly believing what we were seeing. On the way, he began telling us about the very beginning of his unbelievable fight for survival. Colonel Kaler ordered that he be taken straight to his apartment. There, a long-distance call was set up with Crane's family, and he had to work hard to convince his loved ones that it was really him. That's how much their boy had changed. About an hour later, after finishing his report to the colonel, Crane walked out with us. Together, we went straight to the cafeteria, where he started devouring food as if trying to make up for every hungry day.
What amazed us most, he actually looked strong and healthy. In the cabin, all he had to eat was beans, rice, and flour. And yet, somehow, he hadn't lost any weight. He was still dressed in the same clothes he had worn back in December.
But now they were blackened, torn, and hanging in shreds. No one truly believed he would come back until they saw him with their own eyes. And most surprising of all, he didn't even seem broken on the inside. For the Air Corps, this was a true honor. Lieutenant Crane. In October of 1944, Crane led a recovery team to retrieve the remains of his fallen crewmates. They managed to locate Lieutenant James Siebert and Sergeant Ralph Vance. But no sign was ever found of Sergeant Richard Pompeo, who had also jumped from the plane. The pilot, too, was still missing. Many decades later, in 2006, another team returned to the crash site. Sifting through the soil near the wreckage, they came across human remains. Eventually, they identified them as the bones of the pilot, Lieutenant Harold Hoskins. His remains were finally returned to his family and laid to rest with full military honors. As for Pompeo, the man who parachuted down even before Crane, he was never seen again. His final resting place is still a mystery. Lieutenant Leon Crane, who later rose to the rank of captain, managed to survive more than 80 days in the unforgiving wilderness of Alaska. And he did it without training, without survival skills, and without proper equipment. Hunter and writer Stephen Ranella once reflected on Crane's story in his book. There's so much in this tale to admire, and just as much to learn from. Above all, it's Crane's mental and physical toughness. He witnessed the death of his fellow airmen. He endured weeks of hunger, cold, and crushing loneliness. But he refused to give in to despair or make reckless mistakes. He paced himself, he stayed focused, and he kept moving forward. When he walked, he did it with purpose, letting the land itself guide him. His eventual rescue stands as proof that he didn't make any fatal errors. Of course, finding that first cabin was a stroke of luck. But let's not forget, before reaching it, he survived 9 straight days at minus 40 degrees, with no gear at all. And to reach the second cabin, he trekked more than 2 months down a frozen river. That, without a doubt, is one of the most extraordinary survival stories ever told. Leon Crane walked away alive from the deadly trap that Alaska had set for him. And today, his story reminds us of this. Even in the darkest of times, there is always a chance for survival. The key is simple: never give up. If you enjoyed this story, support the channel with a like and a subscription. And stay tuned, even more incredible survival stories are on the way.